I moved into my house just about 8 years ago. It's a small townhome in a completely boring development in small town Minnesota, about half an hour south of Minneapolis. My block has 6 identical buildings, each holding 8 three-story townhomes. It looks as though God was playing The Sims, and rather than build each Sim a unique house, he just copy and pasted the first one until the block was full. I was lucky enough to get an end unit, but it faces the building next to mine, that unit being a mirror image of my own, with just about 12 feet of shared lawn between our front doors. If you look beyond the monotony of living in copycat houses, my new home suited me just fine, and my only concern was the close proximity of so many neighbors. I like to keep to myself, preferring the company of my own dogs above other humans, and I had no interest in meeting, let alone befriending any of my new neighbors. I would have been perfectly content for everyone to think I was a hermit. My family helped me move in, repaint and install new carpet throughout the house, and do some decorating, but after about a week of work, they were finally about to leave and I could begin to really settle into my new space. It was getting late and we were saying our prolonged Minnesota goodbyes at the door when my mom turned and noticed that my neighbor's kitchen light was on. She mused. That is the first time I've seen any signs of life in that house all week. I thought it was vacant. Maybe he's just a nighttime guy. Or a serial killer, my dad joked. Oh, great. I won't need to watch any more true crime on TV if it's happening right next door, I laughed. As we had been moving my things in, I had noticed that every window in my neighbor's unit always had the blinds down, but I hadn't really paid much mind to it until then. It seemed strange, especially since every other home in the neighborhood had their windows wide open to enjoy the cool autumn air. But I understood the desire for privacy, so I didn't really question it. I found that I enjoyed my new neighborhood more than I expected. It was quiet, and thankfully it seems as though the rest of the neighbors were as happy to remain anonymous as I was. There was no welcome wagon, no Susie homemaker showing up with cookies and gossip about Betty Lou whomever, and no drunken bonfires in Barbandale's driveway every other night while the boys are back in town, unironically blares from the old boombox in their garage. You laugh, but that's a thing that actually happens around here pretty regularly, so it was a genuine concern. The boys never left town, Dale. You all grew up here and you all die here. But I digress. Months passed, and I noticed that nothing ever seemed to change at the house next door. My kitchen sink sits directly underneath the window, so anytime I got a glass of water, filled up the bucket for cleaning, or stood there scrubbing dishes, I had nowhere to look but directly at my neighbor's house. From that vantage point, I could see his back patio, kitchen window, front door, the window to his upstairs landing, and most of his driveway. The blinds on every window stayed down, and the window at the door was covered with something as well. Paper of some sort, it looked like. No one ever seemed to be coming or going. There was no patio furniture or flowers like so many of my neighbors had, and the trash and recycling were never put out. Every so often, though, the kitchen light would be on. Always the kitchen light. Only the kitchen light. I tend to keep odd hours myself, and I noticed that the light was never on at the same time or on any discernible schedule. Sometimes 10 p.m., sometimes 1 a.m., sometimes 4 a.m. Eventually, I just assumed that the unit actually was vacant and someone had left the lights on an oddly programmed timer. It was more fun to joke about the serial killer that lived next door, though. He's back, I would text my dad with a blurry photo of the illuminated kitchen window. Hope the dogs are guarding the door, he would joke. He doesn't like to admit it, but my dad has always been a little uneasy around my German Shepherd and Doberman, Rex and Rook. They're the sweetest dogs ever, and honestly big babies that will probably either hide or befriend an actual intruder. But I know he feels better knowing that I have them around. I'm just a young, single woman living alone in the suburbs after all. I was surely in all kinds of danger. Eventually the joke spread to my closest friends and sometimes even directly to Facebook or Twitter. Every time I noticed the kitchen light on, I would text a friend or post that my serial killer neighbor was home, usually to an unenthusiastic response. He's not a serial killer. He probably just works nights. Having a light on at 4 a.m. doesn't make him a serial killer. It makes him an insomniac. Maybe he thinks you're the serial killer. You're the one always spying on his window after all. My friends made valid points. I'll give them that. It was nearly 5 years after moving in and long after most of my friends were sick of my jokes that there was a break in the case. It was already nearly midnight and I still had a bit of work to do, so I decided to refuel with a coffee. All was quiet as I patted down to my kitchen and popped a K-cup into my Keurig. Rex and Rook followed on my heels. While waiting for my coffee to brew, I retrieved the water bowl and went back to the sink to fill it up. But as I turned on the faucet, I glanced out the window and dropped the bowl. gasping in surprise. The neighbor's house had been completely dark just 1 second ago, but now the kitchen light had come to life, and through the blinds I could see the silhouette of a man standing at the window. I stood there, paralyzed for a moment, as the silhouette seemed to lean closer to the window. He could see me. Somehow he could see me. I was sure of it. Instantly I dropped to the floor and crawled over to the switch to turn my lights off. Without any lights in my home to reveal my presence, I mustered the courage to slowly move into a crouching position and peek back through the window. He was gone. Well, at least his light was off again. He could just as easily be standing there in the dark as well, watching me as I peered into the darkness looking for him. Now, not being able to see him made me uneasy. I tried to put the strange encounter out of my mind, but the coffee probably wasn't my best idea because I was up and jittery for the rest of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that night, I felt like I always needed to be on guard in my own home. When I would see his kitchen light on, I would always rush to turn my lights off and stand there silently in the dark, waiting for something to happen. I didn't see the silhouette again, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. I didn't tell my family or friends about what had happened either. They would have thought that I was being dramatic. I would still joke about the serial killer next door from time to time, but it was starting to feel less like a joke. I began to watch the house more closely from every vantage point I had. Sometimes I would linger in my kitchen window to see if he would reappear. When I got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, I would peer down through the window at the landing to see if his light was on. When I would come home late at night, I would pause at the window by the front door, expecting him to be standing on the other side of it. Despite my hypervigilance, it was more than a year before I saw him again. I'm not usually the type to just sit outside, especially in the summer, aka mosquito season, but on one surprisingly cool evening in July, I decided to sit on my front steps and enjoy the uncharacteristically nice weather. The sun had not quite begun to set and I had Rex on a long leash. He sniffed around the perfect place to do his business based on the location of the moon in relation to the ley lines or whatever. I was distracted on my phone when an unfamiliar sound made me snap to attention. Rex was growling. I wasn't kidding when I said this dog was a baby. He's 70 pounds of wuss. The few times I've had people over to my house, he would usually run away and hide. I had never seen him display any kind of aggression toward anyone in his life, but here he was, growling, hair on his back standing straight up and teeth bared at an unfamiliar man standing just a few yards away. I hadn't even heard him approach. The stranger looked so quintessentially suburban, vanilla, if you will. He was white, clean-shaven, and somewhere just shy of 6 feet tall. I guessed he was around 25 to 30 years old. He had short, dark brown hair peeking out from under a Navy Minnesota Twins baseball cap and wore mid-wash denim jeans, a plain light gray t-shirt, and sneakers. He wasn't especially well built, but he definitely had some muscle. His face was long with a strong jaw, slightly crooked nose, and small but very intense brown eyes, and they were staring directly at me. I stood up and the stranger glanced somewhat nervously back at Rex, who was crouched low, ready to lunge, before meeting my gaze again. I could tell that Rex's presence had disoriented him a bit, but he managed to relax his face and appear calm, friendly almost. If it weren't for the oddly intense look in his eyes and Rex's reaction, I may not have perceived him as a threat at all. "I didn't know that you had a dog," he said, cocking his head slightly to the side. I was too on edge at the moment to register just how strange his statement was, or that he had completely skipped over any introductions or pleasantries. There was something so strange about the look in his eyes. "Have you had him very long?" The way he spoke was unusual. There was a certain precision to his words, but his tone was unusually casual as though he knew me. Since he was a puppy," I answered, taking a small step back toward my door. "He's very loyal, I see." The stranger cocked his head toward the other side and smiled a wide, closed-mouthed smile, the look in his eyes never changing. I was startled and cut off as Rook suddenly jumped up at the window by the front door, barking viciously at the stranger. "Oh," the stranger said, taking a step back and straightening up. "You have 2 dogs." I didn't know what to say anymore. Rook was clawing at the door so forcefully that I thought he might actually break through it. Rex's growling grew louder and there was foaming drool dripping from his mouth. "Well, I'd better get going." He turned and walked down toward the garage of the neighboring townhome. Just before rounding the corner, he turned back and smiled widely. "You have a nice day." I heard the garage door close a moment later, pulled Rex inside with me, and after making sure that the door was locked, slid down to sit on the floor. Both dogs were whining, pushing each other's heads out of the way to get a better view from the window. I was thankful for their vigilance, but so shaken that I took them both up to my bedroom, locked that door, and called my friend Marie to tell her what had happened. "What a creep," Marie said as I wrapped up the story. "Rex and Rook have never acted that way, Marie. What if he actually is a serial killer?" "That seems a little dramatic," she laughed. "He definitely sounds weird, but that doesn't mean he actually murders people." "Okay, but you didn't see the look in his eyes. Something is really wrong with this guy." "Uh-huh." She didn't understand. She hadn't seen what I saw or felt what I felt. How can you explain to someone that you just know in your soul that someone is a killer? "One day this is going to be on the news," I said defiantly. "You know how they always interview the neighbors when something like this happens? They always say things like, 'Oh, he was such a sweet young man. He seemed so normal. I never could have guessed.' Well, I guessed. If he doesn't actually kill me, I'll be the first person to tell the reporters that I knew all along that my neighbor was a serial killer. I have killer instincts." "Killer instincts?" she snorted. "Killer instincts." I'm glad she thought it was so funny, but I was taking this seriously. After that day, I became even more vigilant. I also decided to do some online snooping. I consider myself to be a kind of low-rent private eye. I could find just about anything about anyone with a few Google searches, so it wasn't long before I had his name, Derek Johnson. I found his Facebook account and a LinkedIn page that said he was self-employed. Serial Killers R Us wasn't hiring, I suppose. He had an average number of friends on Facebook, and some of his older photos hadn't been set to private, so I skimmed through them looking for clues. I noticed that he was better looking than I had realized. A bit of a Ted Bundy wannabe, if you ask me. Another Google search revealed that Derek currently owned 2 properties. The house next door and the other, a larger property in a neighboring town, which was listed as his actual residence. Clearly the townhome was his murder house. My mind continued to build the story with facts from my surveillance, whatever information I could find through my Google searches, and perhaps a little added drama. I recalled how even in the middle of winter, the heat at his home had never been on, but that the AC had started running sometime around the end of April. Why would he need it so cold, unless the entire house was just a massive cooler? I deduced that he must be a cannibal. I was sure that I had picked up some Dahmer vibes. As I continued my research and surveillance, I started to see Derek, or signs of him, more frequently. A few times there was a car in the driveway, a large, dark-colored 4-door sedan. I noted the ample trunk space, perfect for transporting groceries, aka bodies. On one occasion, I saw Derek on his patio. He had a small fire pit and was sweeping some kind of pebbles or sand from the patio and dumping it into the fire. No, not sand. It must be crushed up bone. What else would he do with them otherwise? It's not like you can just pull a Gacy and recklessly bury skeletons on your property these days. And what could it be if not bone fragments? You don't see anyone else sweeping their patios and burning the sand, do you? You only do that if you have something to hide. Whenever I witnessed him coming or going, it was always at odd hours. At one point, my mom had suggested that he was simply getting the place ready to rent out. But who shows up at 1 a.m. to do work on their rental house, and without ever bringing any tools or supplies? A friend guessed that perhaps he was a phone sex operator and saw the most traffic late at night. But since when does a phone sex operator need a whole house to do the job? Rocco did it from a cubicle, for God's sake. Nothing else made sense. Derek was a serial killer, I was certain. I just needed actual proof. I was updating Marie on the latest goings-on one night when she hit me with her own theory. "He's just like you," she said matter-of-factly. What? Did my best friend just call me a serial killer? "He must be a writer like you," she answered triumphantly. "It makes perfect sense. You both have kind of weird hours because you can work whenever. You prefer to be alone so you don't get distracted." "Oh," I said, relieved. "Right. Sure. I guess that makes some sense. It's a decent guess. I don't think he's a writer, though." "If you say so," she sighed. I did say so. But I will admit that she had the most logical explanation yet. Still, I know he wasn't a writer. I can spot one of my own. And anyway, now I know I was right. 3 nights ago, I was at my usual perch by the kitchen window when something new happened next door. Around 2:30 a.m., the dark sedan pulled into the driveway. The lights turned off, the engine cut, and Derek exited the driver's side. He didn't head straight into the garage, though, but instead walked around the car and opened the passenger door. A girl? Oh my God, I whispered to myself. The girl stumbled a little bit as she climbed out of the car, but Derek caught her. He said something and she laughed, leaning into him a little more. She was clearly drunk, or drugged. Either way, she was not thinking straight and had clearly fallen into a dangerous situation. She was young, no more than 21. It was just after bar closed, so he easily could have picked her up at one of the local bars. She had long blonde hair, don't they always, and was wearing a short dress with a floral pattern. It would have looked very sweet and innocent if it wasn't so low cut. She looked like just about every other young girl in town, but I imagined that we would all have her face burned into our memories when it was on every local news channel and printed on the front page of the paper. I could see the headline now. Young woman missing, presumed dead. I watched from the window as he helped the girl inside, and the light faded from the garage as the door rolled down. I waited for a few minutes, but the kitchen light never came on, nor did any other. Maybe you don't need lights for what they're doing. Maybe she never made it out of the garage. I stayed up for another hour or so, periodically checking back at the window. No change. I didn't hear any screaming either, so I decided to just go to bed, telling myself that my imagination really had run too far this time. By the time I woke next morning, afternoon, the sedan was gone. I still felt uneasy, so I spent the day re-examining my evidence. In all of my surveillance, I had never seen Derek bring someone back to the house, at least not someone that was still walking, however clumsily. That didn't mean that he hadn't had people in that very large trunk, though. On more than one occasion, I had seen the sedan arrive, only to hide away in the garage rather than sitting in the driveway. But on that track, why would he let the girl out of the car in the driveway, if he could have pulled the car in the driveway and not risked someone seeing her? Maybe he knows I've been watching. Maybe he wanted me to see. Then again, I thought, maybe I actually am just being overly dramatic. I started to consider that maybe this was just a house that Derek kept to sleep around. I hadn't uncovered any marriage records in my online sleuthing, but that didn't mean that he wasn't living with a fiancé or girlfriend at his other house and using this as a place to go when he wanted a little fun with some drunk, lonely townie. The day got away from me, as it tends to do when you arise afternoon, and before I knew it, it was getting dark outside and I hadn't eaten all day. I decided to go see what leftovers I had left in the fridge, but as I turned the corner into my kitchen and flicked the lights on, I stopped dead in my tracks. For the first time in almost 8 years, the blinds on Derek's kitchen window were open, and standing at the window was the girl. I've never seen such terror in someone's eyes. She was desperately pulling at the window, but obviously too panicked to realize it was locked. Her face was badly beaten, her left eye swollen shut and lips split so deeply it looked as though it could have been cut with scissors. You almost couldn't tell that her hair was blonde with all of the blood. It was stuck to her face in several places where the blood had begun to dry, but she clearly didn't have time to be concerned with how her hair looked. Her dress was also badly stained and ripped in several places. No amount of towel was saving it, probably also not her greatest concern. It seemed like I stood there for several minutes trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it must have been only seconds before she noticed me. I saw a spark of hope flash in her one functioning eye. She started frantically waving and hitting at the window. Her mouth was wide, repeatedly calling out, "Help! Help me!" You must have had some top-notch soundproofing done in that house because I couldn't hear a thing. Her right hand was bloody and left streaks and splatters on the glass each time she hit it. I could see that her pointer finger on that hand was missing entirely. She was so distracted with begging me for help that she didn't seem to hear Derek coming up behind her, but my eyes locked on him immediately. He moved slowly, deliberately, so as not to spook his prey. He was bleeding from his head as well. The girl must have hit him with something in her attempt to escape, but clearly she hadn't swung hard enough. As he crept closer, his gaze suddenly shifted from the panicked young girl to me, and he paused, smiling. His eyes had that same fiery look that he had had that day in my yard, and suddenly I realized what it was. Hunger. It was hunger. He raised his left hand and dangled something as though he wanted to show it off to me. The girl's missing finger. Without breaking eye contact, he raised the finger to his lips, sucking on the severed end. After a moment, he closed his eyes, clearly enjoying the hors d'oeuvre. My eyes widened and a familiar wave rolled through my stomach. I bent over the sink for a second, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back. This is it. This is the moment that confirms all of my suspicions. Suddenly, the girl stopped and stood very still. Maybe she had heard him behind her. I wanted her to know that I could see her, that I could see what was happening to her. So I took a step toward the window, looked directly in her eyes, and nodded. Relief washed over her face for a moment, but it didn't last. Her functioning eye narrowed and she tilted her head ever so slightly in confusion as I calmly reached into the drawer next to the sink, retrieved a fork and knife and held them up for her to see. For both of them to see. I think she did finally understand, though, in her final moments, as Derek's knife slid effortlessly across the flesh of her throat. I was coming for dinner.